Hey everyone, welcome to the Interview podcast. My name is Allie Nelson. I hope you're all having a great week so far. I've been watching the news, and one thing that I think all Canadians feel that I don't know if Americans know about is that we are very into American news and politics. I doubt Americans know what is going on up here in Canada, but a lot of us Canadians, we feel very connected to everything going on in the States. And of course, Donald Trump is now president of the United States again. But I am not one to talk politics really on this platform. But the TikTok ban was something that, even though I could still use the app, I was really on the edge of my seat about. I was going to be so sad if it got banned for our American friends. Luckily, it only took effect for 13 hours, but most of the content I consume online is US, it is American, and I still hope they don't ban it later on for our American creators. So I felt like today was a good day to talk a little bit about technology and social media. My guest today is Jocelyn Brewer. Jocelyn is an Australian psychologist, digital well-being educator, and cyberpsychology researcher. In 2013, she founded Digital Nutrition, a positive technology use philosophy for young people, parents, and workplaces to help all humans be well connected. Today, we discuss what healthy technology use looks like, why food is a better comparison than drugs when talking about tech consumption, iPad kids, cyberbullying, how parents should navigate technology and social media with their children, and so much more. I am someone who went into this conversation thinking that I basically never want to give my children any handheld tech until they're 16, 17, even older. And Jocelyn provided some really great counterpoints to my position that I am definitely going to think about when raising my son. So I found this conversation very thoughtful and very eye-opening. I've linked Jocelyn's socials and website in the show notes below, and really hope you enjoyed the show. And now, let's get into the episode. Jocelyn Brewer, welcome to the Interview podcast.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Welcome to the show. I'm so excited to be talking with you today. You know so much about technology and what you've coined as digital nutrition. But before we get into that, I would love to ask you a little bit about your background and how you got to studying and working in the field that you do.
Yeah, cyberpsychology is such a new and emerging field, and we often talk about young people as, going to have jobs of the future. Well, I'm kind of technically not a young person anymore. I'm a middle-aged white woman. And I have one of those jobs of the future that in 2008, when I was a high school teacher, I taught geography and commerce and a lot of those social sciences. I was training to become a school counselor, which is basically, I think you would call them guidance counselors or school psychologists. I was doing a training program and had to do some research. And the principal that I was working with at Sydney Boys said, you should check out what's going on with boys and games. And we were at the time handing out laptops to everyone in Year 9 across Australia. And he was like, there's something going on there. So that's really how I got into it in 2008 when I did this research project. And I'm a bit like a dog with a bone when I get into something and I find it quite interesting. And here we are, and many years later with lots of different technology that's obviously challenging us as a species in lots of different ways, and not just young people and children, but I would say us as well, really pushing the limits of our brains.
Yeah, absolutely. It's crazy. Even, there's so many pros to it. You and I are talking from opposite ends of the world, which is so cool and so amazing. But we obviously know too that there are a lot of challenges that come with technology and social media as well. So to get into it, what is digital nutrition?
Sure. So digital nutrition is really an antidote to the idea of digital detoxing. And I came up with the idea live in a radio kind of conversation about 10 years ago when there was this rise, and there still is a lot of conversation about the idea of digital detoxing. And to me, that really spoke to diet culture and a whole bunch of other icky kind of stuff that I just know is not sustainable. That makes us think that we have to do this big revolutionary change, but that never actually sticks around. So really what it is a tech use philosophy that's really positive. It's very practical, and it uses the analogy with food instead of drugs, which, I find kind of unhelpful, to really help parents that's kind of where my work started, but all humans understand what the kind of virtual vitamins, what's contained in what we're doing. So when we talk about technology, that's the tool. When we talk about the platform, whether it's even within social media platforms, there's differences, I guess, between how we might consume things in YouTube versus TikTok, and the styles, the nuances within those platforms, or even within gaming platforms. So what I try to do is really kind of have practical strategies that people can apply using that kind of digital diet analogy and what is healthy. It's okay to eat some cake here and there, but if you have gluten intolerance, or you have, you're allergic to peanuts, then you've got to be really careful of what you consume. So what I'm trying to do is not make managing screen time a burden, which it
Mm.
often is, and it often does fall to the mother. Women are usually the people who are managing that. So what I'm trying to do is really just help people get a clear understanding of how we can consume stuff to nourish us without freaking out all the time that we're going to be addicted.
Yeah, I love that. And before we get into what healthy and nutritious digital consumption would be, I want to talk a little bit about that reference you made to finding it unhelpful to compare technology use to drug use. Because you hear that a lot of it's an addiction, it's a drug, weaning off it, or like having to go cold turkey and take these full days off of tech. Why don't you find that the most helpful kind of comparison out there?
Yeah, look, because illicit drug use has become weaponized, right? The war on drugs is something that has failed significantly in
Right.
most Western country. And we actually understand drug users to have trauma most of the time, right? What I find really unhelpful is the idea that if it's a drug, why are parents handing it out? Like that makes us the drug dealers. So that's one. Two is technology, like I said, is a tool. If I used a syringe, a hypodermic needle, I could be getting a COVID vaccine. I could be using insulin to support me if I had childhood diabetes, or I could be mainlining heroin,
Hmm.
or methamphetamine. So tech as a tool, there's some people that would go, oh no, it's designed to be addictive. There are elements within that. And if you know that, you can avoid those things, right?
Right.
So I just don't think really using that analogy, and it's used badly too. Like I've seen headlines where it's like, giving your child a smartphone is like using 1 gram of cocaine. And I'm like, who did that research? Who worked out it was 1 gram of cocaine? How pure is that cocaine? Then I've seen other headlines that say it turns your kids into heroin junkies. And I'm like, that's a very different drug to cocaine. Which one are we talking about here? So it's used salaciously. It's used to get you to
Mm.
freak out, because when you're in freak out, you're probably clicking and reading a whole bunch of crap information that make you think, oh, I will just stop my kid from using technology because it's all bad and I don't understand it. As opposed to saying, what are they actually consuming? I'm probably going to have to learn a little bit about Roblox or Minecraft or whatever they're consuming. And
Right.
yeah, that's inconvenient and takes your time, but that's your due diligence as a parent that we need to do. Simple as that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And so when we think about it in terms of nutrition or compared to food, you know, food is great for us. It helps us, survive and live. And I think in this world, in this day and age, you need to use technology. Like it would be very hard, very difficult to live in the first world and not be able to use technology to do your job, do school, any of that. So I totally agree. It's like drugs is this thing that, in society is like, don't ever do that. But technology, you can't really live without it.
What's really interesting too about drugs is that things like MDMA, which were discovered, and lots of the psychedelic drugs, all of these drugs are now coming back in a controlled way to treat mental health.
Hmm.
So there's something really interesting about some of the drugs that have become, those illicit drugs, that
Yeah.
we're now saying, oh, they actually have a. So there's a whole bunch of yuck around illicit drugs. We made them illicit because we recognize their power.
Yeah. I've heard that mushrooms are being used in like micro doses to
All
enhance
of
your,
yeah. There's a whole
focus.
nother
And
realm of things going on there. Absolutely.
yeah. So thinking about it in that food context or that mindful, nutritious context, what would you describe as content or technology that is quote unquote good for us or healthy?
So the way I kind of get people to think about it is just getting beyond the notion of screen time. So time as a metric, yes, that's important because we all only have 24 hours in the day. But looking at what is the quality of the content. So what are you actually consuming? When people focus on the 2 hours per day for most kids, if that's really inappropriate, kind of nefarious content, then I would say any minutes of that is not necessarily what you want your kids to be consuming. So we want to look at what is it that they're doing. So is that watching, some of the different more educational shows? It will also depend on developmentally their age.
Right.
We then want to look at the context. So zoom out, look at the bigger picture. What have they done for the rest of their day? What's going on in the world? So in COVID lockdowns, thank goodness we had technology. That saved our backsides as parents because we could, lean on that a little bit more. And for some people, they definitely overlent on that and the washout of that is still happening.
Mm.
But, ultimately in the middle of winter when it's raining outside, using technology more makes sense. But going to a kid's birthday party and being on your iPhone, you're missing some social connections. So content, context, cognitions is the other one. So actually zooming in and having a look at, and this is the really hard one and what research doesn't look at, what am I thinking when I'm consuming that? When I'm scrolling on Instagram and I'm seeing all this aspirational content and this content that makes me compare myself to an influencer who is being paid to, micro curate their world. What am I thinking? Am I thinking this is a load of BS and I actually don't want my life to be like that? Or am I thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not enough. I need to be skinnier, prettier, smarter, spend more time online. So getting into the
Right.
cognition, the other one.
That's so interesting because I think as a parent, not that I'm a parent yet, but it'd be really hard to kind of dissect like what is my child feeling looking at this? And I think for teens, maybe not as much younger kids, but teens, social media is part and parcel with their social life. And you're just at an age where all you do is compare yourself to your peers and you want to make sure that you fit in and you want to make sure that you are wearing the like cool clothes or doing the cool thing. So it's like, how do you as a parent take stock or check in with your child to understand how they're feeling if they're consuming their friends' content or, YouTubers' content that is, potentially making them say, okay, where do I fit in relation?
So a lot of this has to do with the communication strategies that we have with our kids. And I talk about communicating really as being the core ingredient to solving most of the world's problems, quite frankly. And this is something that you need to build a bridge to. It's not something that you can one day just go, hey, I heard a podcast where somebody said I should check in on your feelings when you're, scrolling Instagram. Tell me how you're feeling because kids are probably like, oh God, I don't want to talk to you. We need to actually start that quite early. And where there's that bridge has been broken or that bridge is a really like dodgy rope bridge that's falling apart, we really need to then reconnect and reestablish those communication strategies within our homes so that kids can, and adolescents as they get older, they don't necessarily want to talk to their parents, and that's very natural. But when something goes wrong, how do you notice that feeling of this is a bit icky? I need some support here, or I want to share this with, my parent. So it's not something that you can switch on. A lot of these skills that I teach are actually nothing to do with technology. It's not about how
Right.
to like put parental controls on or how to, keep your kids safe. It's what are the skills under here, in your skull, the most complex piece of technology on the planet still that you can deploy regularly to kind of buffer against everything in our world. Again, not necessarily just tech, it's just a lot of the information we consume comes through those devices.
Yeah. Thinking about healthy consumption as well, does the timing of videos have anything to do with that for you? So, for example, 10-second videos on TikTok, like, is that destroying our attention spans? Would you consider that type of content unhealthy?
Yeah. So the way the mind works and cognitive habits work are really through practice. So if you practice paying attention for 10 seconds, and just like people have to practice and get good at delivering key messages in 10 seconds, right? I have not mastered that. I blither on, and talk way too long because I haven't practiced trying to chop a message in 10 seconds so that I can get somebody's attention for that. So is it destroying our attention spans? Well, it's crafting our attention span to be based on what we consume. If we were crafting our attention span based on novels or based on 30 minutes, then we probably would find a way to pay attention to that too. It's the attention economy which sits behind how quickly can we get you to flick your attention so that we can deliver an ad to you, so that you will buy that thing, so that capitalism, right?
Right. Yeah.
So is it destroying our attention? Well, no, it's shaping our attention based on the inputs. If we think positively, we hopefully shape our cognition. If we have that negativity bias that always shows up, that shapes our cognitions. So again, we have to be really, really careful of what we are consuming, what's in that digital diet. There's a place for TikTok, but that is not the main meal, right? So we need to be watching some 20-minute videos. We need to be, still reading, and whether that's online or offline doesn't really matter. We need to, there's a place for keeping up with celebrities in 10-second increments. That's probably as much celebrity as I could deal with half the time. So really diversifying that, not saying we don't do this or we don't do that, unless you know that you kind of have an allergy to it. Like if, as I said before, like if you're gluten intolerant or you're allergic to something, you have to be really careful. For me, I do not go on TikTok. It just sets my brain on fire because there's so much going on and I'm so interested. So I just kind of have said, I don't do TikTok. I keep away from that. That's okay.
Yeah, my husband had to delete TikTok because he was like, I can't do it. Like, I will
Yeah.
stay there for 3 hours if I'm
Mhm.
allowed. And he had to delete it just because I think some people, maybe they're not as pulled, or maybe their feed's not as curated, so it's not as interesting, and they kind of have that ability to step back, but some people don't. And like even myself, I can spend 2 hours on TikTok, no problem. Sometimes I'll use it to be like, oh, I'm waiting to leave to go to dinner and I have 30 minutes and I want it to go by quickly. And I'll be like, TikTok.
Yeah. And because that's there and that's an option on the menu, right? Like you could pick up a novel and read a novel for 30 minutes. But
Right.
because it's there and it's kind of more salient, it's more kind of in your face, and maybe it's aligned to your work. You're kind of researching who else you want to have on the podcast. Whatever your thing is, that's just something that you, as a free thinking human, can then go and choose to do.
I wanted to ask you what your opinion of quote unquote iPad kids is.
Well, I think really more importantly is what's my opinion on iPad parents who give the kid the iPads, because
Fair.
an iPad doesn't just turn up. There's no iPad fairy like, oh, you turn 7, you can have an iPad. The spirit of Steve Jobs has just kind of landed you this really expensive device.
Yeah.
So again, I would just kind of encourage people to notice how we put the shame and blame on little people all the time. We love to do it with teenagers, right? Like,
hmm
supporting young people. They're the ones who are about to inherit the planet that we have really, screwed up. And constantly we are telling them what to do from the people who often have screwed it up the most. So what I would say about iPad kids is they're just dealing with what's put in front of them. It's like if you were fed like the sugary cereal, you
hmm
ate them because somebody bought them and gave them to you. In a game of Would You Rather, a kid's not going to say, oh, Mum, you know what? I think I'll choose not to use the iPad and connect with all of my friends online. I think I'll go and choose to read an Enid Blyton book. We have this like weird nostalgia about our own childhoods. And then we expect these random choices from young people that their brain architecture is just not there to make. So I put it back to the parents in a non-judgmental way, because usually parents are just doing the best they can with what they know. And they think that buying an iPad and having this really expensive, fancy device that they give to kids is a sign of affluence and a sign of doing a good job because capitalism. So, I kind of feel a bit snarky around that, because I think it's so easy for us to get into oh, it's the iPhones, isn't it? And I'm like, no, it's society.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
just one tool that we can blame really easily. And I don't think necessarily that's fair or true.
Yeah, absolutely. What age would you give a child a device, like a handheld device? So not TV, but an iPad or a phone.
Yeah. So again, content and context is everything. What's the context of having that? So are we talking about, and there's so many ways that this can play out, are we talking about giving a child their own smartphone, right?
hmm
I would say there's not an age that magically, again, they wake up, oh, I'm 13. I now tick all the boxes for social media. It's actually looking at developmentally, what are the things that they're showing us? Are they showing us that they can help seek when something dodgy happens? Are they showing us when they can come home and tell us about the day and tell us about the things that went well, but also the things that didn't go well? Because if they're not able to do some of those things, when they're given their own device and they're in online spaces that inevitably they will come across either fights with their friends or strangers trying to make contact with them,
Yeah.
that they need to be able to demonstrate those skills of help seeking before they get the device. So parents have a whole bunch of work to do, really, to check in with, do I not just trust my kid on the device, but do I trust them to be able to deal with other, sometimes bad actors
Hmm.
who are in those spaces? So, my daughter is about to turn 7 and she has a love of TV, but she also occasionally uses my phone, or she uses my phone to get to sleep. So I actually play some bedtime stories and then some kind of relaxing music for her to get to sleep. And she will occasionally use her dad's iPad, and only when she asks for it. And that's usually on the weekend. So is that giving a child a device? Yeah, I would say it is. It comes with really clear rules, which is you need to do 20 minutes of reading eggs in order to go and play the games that you want to play. Okay. So
Gotcha.
context is everything. And the other question that I ask about, is your kid ready to have the device, is actually, are you ready for the responsibility of what that means for your kid? Because it's not then, oh, well, you were using the iPad, you were doing that thing. You still have to have oversight, right?
Yeah.
It's not like, is my kid, like the kind of analogy there is my kid ready to go in the pool on their own? We don't just say, oh, well, you're 13. Yes, you're ready to swim in the deep end. We go, well, what are your swimming skills like? And do I still need to kind of be observing you from the side to make sure you don't end up on the bottom of the pool? Or am I, sitting back on a sunbed reading a book? I think we kind of do this weird thing with technology where we go, oh, well, they're digital natives, which is totally not the case. They're digital orphans. They're growing up without people above them often who know what's going on. We give that to them and go, oh, they're so good with technology. They were like born knowing how to use it. Yeah, but they weren't born with the skills to use it in a savvy way and deal with the intrapersonal stuff that happens in those spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you don't think there's any age that's too young potentially for a device? Like, say saw a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old with an iPad at a restaurant. Say the parents are just trying to have a meal.
The main things I would say is, well, what are they watching? And what's the context? They might be on the iPad and well, they're not interacting with their child. Maybe they've just been to their swimming lessons or gymbaroo or all these things, and they've done stuff all day and they've been on the go and the kids had a really great nap. And yet now at a restaurant, not the natural habitat of children, restaurants, cafes, you might have noticed, they're not really designed for them. Yeah. And if it's a fancy restaurant, you definitely might put the kid on that because society says kids should sit at the table and they should act like little adults, even though from a neurobiological perspective, they're not designed to do that. So it's all about crafting behavior and socially acceptable behavior so that everyone can have a lovely time at their restaurant. So
Yeah.
is that too young? Like I would say if that's happening for hours and that's your go-to and the only way that kids self-soothes is with a device, obviously problematic. But if it's used on occasion when you do go out to keep that kid occupied so that you can have a nice night, mate, we've got to do what we need to do as parents to get through this wacky world we're in.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think people as onlookers have no idea what has gone on the rest of their day. It's so easy to judge. And I think like I'm definitely guilty of that too. I'll be like, well, are they ever going to learn how to sit still at a restaurant and like have to be bored in a place that they don't like?
Yeah.
But there's probably other opportunities where they do that.
Yeah. Like this idea that kids need to learn to be bored, that's again so problematic. And it comes from just this sociocultural conditioning where we made up that sitting still was a good tool, right? Like that's a good target behavior. You look at kids in, developing countries or even in like the Pacific. If you go to Fiji, kids are roaming around, they're climbing trees, they're picking coconuts, like they're living these really embodied living playgrounds. They're not sitting in artificial environments expecting, again, neurobiologically, them to switch into an adult frame of mind. Boredom, if it's not constructed in a way that can be positive, turns kids into potentially juvenile delinquents. You get into doing the wrong thing because you're bored, then you're, not necessarily safe and doing positive things. So this whole like boredom thing, I'm like, oh, please. You hate
Yeah.
being bored as an adult. Why make a little person do that?
Yeah, I hear you. I think about that. Even I'm just reflecting on my own thoughts around it because same thing. You get nostalgic about your own childhood and you're like, well, I didn't have that. What did I do? But I don't think I was bored. I think I just like made up other stuff to do. And I think maybe what people are getting at is trying to push a child's creativity or like own ingenuity to make fun or like make a game or do something that isn't reliant on a screen providing that entertainment for them.
Yeah. And again, we have to foster that. So we can't take that screen away and give them nothing else to do. Right?
Hmm.
If you live in an apartment, and increasingly in a city like Sydney, we are trying to develop like more housing because there's not enough. And
Hmm.
what does that look like? Well, no one's planning for green spaces. No one's planning to make sure there's enough basketball hoops for kids to actually play. We say, oh no, don't be addicted to your phone, but also we won't give you a park to play in. So just go be bored in your like little,
Shoebox.
square house, tiny house, and like don't have needs. And again, I think that's really, really unfair. So if we want kids to do something else, we have to role model that, right? This year my daughter's in year 2 and we decided that TV in the mornings needed to stop. She used to get up a lot earlier and we'd watch cartoons and whatever. So I was like, yeah, that's got to change. So this year, even though it's hard, she woke up after, the weekend, it's Monday here, and she was like, oh, I'd really love some TV this morning. And I went, yeah, it's hard to shift out of the weekend into whatever. What can we go and do? Now, I have to be ready as a parent to deal with the fact she's going to make some mess in her room right now.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, that's the consequence, I guess, for not being on screens, which again, I find that a lot of parents, especially mums, just love screens because they're not like the glitter and the craft and the glue and the paint and all those things that are messy. Creativity is really quite messy. And yes, you can do a lot of those things using an iPad and using whatever, but often we just have to be willing to do that hard work if we want to then foster offline activities in kids.
Yeah. You mentioned role modeling as well. And I think about all the people who are adults and very addicted to their phones. I'm definitely addicted to my phone to a degree. And
You're not addicted. You compulsively use it because it's meeting your psychological needs, right? Like addiction, we love to call things addictive because it is that salacious word, but you're a compulsive user because there's something about what you get through that that meets those psychological needs. And if we pull back and look at what are those psychological needs, most likely it's something to do with connection, it's something to do with control, and it's something to do with competence.
Mm.
And examining that will help you then work out how you can be more aligned to what you really want to be doing. So, the connection that you get in that 30 minutes before you go out or whatever, and you are using TikTok, you're connecting with ideas, you're connecting with people, you're catching up with friends. So that addiction comes from the idea that you are just seeking to have that need met. And that's how we survive as humans.
Right. But the one thing I'm wondering, like, as I wait for the elevator for 1 minute, do I need to pull out my phone?
No, of course you
One
don't.
minute.
But you live in a free society where you have free will and you can choose to do that. And what we do is we actually look around and we are constantly making judgments based on what other people do. When my daughter used to go to a little kind of jump around dance class, there was clear signs that said, do not film in here. There's child protection issues, permission issues, don't film. And invariably there'd be some grandma who would come along and hadn't been to the class before and just whips out a phone and starts filming the kid dancing around. And you watch the contagion effect, then it gives permission to everyone else to whip out their phone
Hmm.
and to start doing that. So we look around and we make judgments. That's how we do our social learning. We make judgments about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And never in the history of humanity has like chatting to the person next to you in a lift been a thing that we did, right? And again, we go, oh, we're on our phones when we could be communicating face to face. I'm like, we never did that in a lift. We never sat on a train and like struck up a conversation with a random human next to us. In fact, that would be creepy and weird. So again, we have this it's just uncritical ways of examining our world and then blaming technology for everything. Anyway, that was a side thing when you said I'm addicted to my phone.
No, no, that's okay. I saw this photo and it was, people this day and age, I don't know, 20 something, 20, something. And it was just like a bus full of people looking at their smartphones. But then it was contrasted with, sometime in the 1950s or 60s, and everyone had a newspaper.
Yeah.
And it's like everyone was just as into what they were reading
Mhm.
or looking at. It was just paper media. It wasn't zero media.
Absolutely. And it was, in the city that I'm in, you had two newspapers. One was a kind of Fox News tabloid, and the other is a broadsheet, which is, like, I don't know, 20 years ago, it was much more independent journalism. Now they're basically commercial, but everything's changed. But again, the type of newspaper that you were reading, you got one particular story.
Mm-hmm. So getting back to modeling, do you just recommend like parents abide by the rules they're setting for their children, or what sorts of strategies do you recommend for parents who do have that phone handy all the time?
Yeah. So often my approach with setting kind of agreements, and it's much more of an agreement than it is a contract. So I'm all about pacts. Let's make a pact or agreement rather than making a contract where we say, we will only do these things and you will sign here. It's not worth the paper that it's written on. What I suggest parents do is actually sit down, and I've got a course that teaches this, is to sit
Perfect.
down and talk about what's good and what's not good about technology. To actually think about, well, I notice that there's this point when I am on TikTok, I go from really vibing to just feeling really like exhausted and then agitated. And so being able to do that social emotional work and tune into that and then make a plan around it. So what I suggest is the whole family has an agreement, but then each person within the family makes their own little, set of guidelines for what they need. Because if I have, my 6.5-year-old and then a 13-year-old, they're going to have different agreements on what they need to be doing based on what their school is asking them to do. For
Right.
homework, for instance, they're going to have different co-curricular or extracurricular activities that they're doing. And we really look at the idea that once you've had good sleep, you've had enough exercise, and then you've done all the jobs that you need to do. So in my case, my daughter has to look after her rabbit. She needs to get her homework done. Then maybe we can talk about what kinds of online activities she would like to do. And that's broken down quite clearly into TV, whether it's YouTube TV or it's kind of general streaming TV. And then it's broken down further into using the iPad, which, as I said before, you've got to do some reading eggs before then you go into the other activities. So that's just a quick look at it. I go through really how to break it down and how to notice. Again, if you have kids who are neurodivergent, they're on the autism spectrum, they have ADHD, they have other, reading challenges and things like that, we can have a really different digital diet for them based on their vulnerabilities and those kind of allergens that they might have compared to, say, a neurotypical kid who is doing tons of extracurricular stuff and, things like that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I like that you've kind of divided it differently for kids at different ages. That's really smart to not just have like a blanket rule, because of course your kids are going to have different needs.
Yeah. And when you have kids, you realize even when you have two of them and they're twins, they don't do the same thing.
Right.
They are completely their own people and they have, really different interests and all of that sort of stuff. So the trick with parenting is just because you've done it once doesn't mean that those skills necessarily translate onto the next kid. You get a completely different kid. You have to learn a whole bunch of other things.
Oh man, so true. Do you watch the shows in advance of what you might allow your child to watch, or how do you go about vetting content?
It's called a rating system, right? It's been around since the 80s, good old G, PG, parental guidance, all those sorts of things. Um, I do, the problem with YouTube, obviously, is that it's not rated. If you're on YouTube Kids, you're hoping that the system has and, YouTube can't watch everything that's uploaded. It's relying most of the time on humans not being jerks and uploading inappropriate material. So you might have heard, sometimes people upload Peppa Pig and need to splice it with some really yucky
Oh
kind
my
of content, and then
God.
it freaks kids out. So we do
That's
have to be careful if you're,
awful.
yeah, there's all sorts of creepy people out there that, have too
Jesus.
much time on their hands. So we need to have the oversight. But generally, if you're watching like CBS Kids or some of those, usually they're like public broadcasters, they're going to have a lot of quality content. And in the US, have Common Sense Media. I mean, anyone anywhere can access it, but they have 50,000 reviews of games, TV shows, films, apps, all of that sort of stuff. So as parents, we can kind of go to those and work out what it's about without, having to sit through. My daughter's favorite one at the moment is 12 Forever. And that's really clever and really fun. There's also, Uncle Grandpa, and there's all these like really fun shows that she's into that really it's about co-viewing. So while I don't watch it ahead, most of the time I'm sitting with her and maybe I'm doing my own journaling or rewriting my list of what I have to do tomorrow. Or sometimes I'm even on my laptop, paying some bills or doing whatever, so that I can be kind of keeping an ear out to what she's viewing. So then we can talk about it later. That wasn't it funny how Pizza Steve like went and did this, funny thing and blah, blah, blah. So knowing what she's consuming, knowing the characters, knowing kind of, I guess in our day, everyone knew like who Indiana Jones was,
Yeah.
Inspector Gadget was, right? Like we know about it. You might not have watched every single thing, but there was that way to have that conversation. So again, parents don't need to like spend that much time, but you do need to sometimes even fake interest in the stuff that they're doing in online spaces, right? Minecraft, oh, that's so dumb. That's just killed off a little bit of your bridge to communication because that kid has heard that what I'm doing doesn't matter. You think it's silly. So if something goes wrong in that, I'm not going to come to you and talk to you about it because you're going to tell me it's silly and possibly take it away. And
Right.
for young people, taking their devices away, cutting them off from their online activities is worse than a family pet dying.
Yeah.
It's just like, so we need to be really conscious about the messages that we send out to kids about what they're doing in online spaces.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you as well about, in terms of that nutrition digitally, what about facts versus misinformation on the internet and teaching kids what's not true and what is true and what's manipulated? Like that's so complex. I think even as adults, it's hard to get to the real answers of anything. So when you introduce a child or a kid's brain to that, how do you prepare them for what they might see or read is like could potentially be just so fabricated or not true at all?
Absolutely. So what we really need to place an emphasis on is media literacy. And it's not just about fake news, it's about misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, right? So, oops, I accidentally shared something that was, 30 years out of date. That's misinformation. Disinformation and malinformation, disinformation is purposely, trying to throw things, and malinformation is the really bad information that's designed to cause harm. So the
Mm,
more that we start to actually understand that there are people who want to share with us information that will hurt us in order to win elections or sell a product or, whatever that might be, these are absolutely complex skills, but we need to start early and we need to train ourselves as well, because I see a lot of adults sharing misinformation or a little bit of information. And this is obvious, often around neurodivergence. So I stalk a lot of like parenting groups and digital parenting groups. And often people will say, oh, my kid's really disorganized. I need like a tutor or someone to help them get organized. And there's always people going, oh, your kid needs an ADHD assessment and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, wow, I never knew there was so many people in this group that were like qualified psychologists in ADHD assessment. So there's often like, different ways that people are throwing out what they know and their best intention to try and help someone that is categorically untrue,
mm.
that they are not trained to share that information. And I guess the opportunity that was social media was everyone has a platform, everyone has an opinion. Rather than there being, if we go back 300 years, there was a town crier who, rung the bell and said, hear ye, hear ye. Here's what the king's doing today, or, here's what the sheriff wants you to know. there wasn't this like sort of grapevine of information where, farmers would say, oh, the back creek has lots of tadpoles in there. We're going to get lots of frogs, or watch out for this. I think there's a, wolf on the run over here. So that kind of information is really what social media and the internet initially was designed to do, was to be able to communicate in all these different networks. So we've lost a bit of that when there is such influence of disinformation and the way that the algorithms work, which really is to promote sensational material.
Mhm.
And, I like to point out that the algorithm in China on TikTok works very, very differently to the algorithm in the rest of the world. They promote educational
I've heard
content. They
this.
promote. So it's within the grasp, of all of these tech companies to do better. And it's a flick of a switch. It's really not, oh, we have to build this whole other giant computer to do things. It's like they get their coders to code it so it works differently. It's not that hard. They like to just backpedal on some of those things.
Yeah. Do you think they're not incentivized to
Of
do
course they're not.
the right thing?
They're not. And, Meta being worth over $1 trillion still doesn't incentivize, like, hey guys, I think that's enough money that we need to earn. How can we contribute back? Right? There's no, like, when you have enough money, you turn into a better person. Usually having more money turns you into a worse person from, my experience. There's some people and philanthropists that you see then really do take chunks of their income and like redivest it. But if you were to like survey all of the billionaires in the world, or even the trillionaires in the world, the $1 trillion company, how much of their bottom line are they putting into true giving back? And even the way they give back is probably going to further their position, but probably me
Yeah.
just being super cynical.
I wanted to talk a little bit about social media for children, and that concept of bullying kind of following you home. Because a lot of people talk about that concept of, if kids were mean, at least it was at school and they could come home to their safe place. And now they have a device that connects them to all those mean kids. And it's like a 24/7 potential experience of bullying.
Mm. So I just point out that most social media platforms are for kids over 13. Okay. So if you have chosen to allow your child as a 10-year-old to be in those spaces, then, not to say, well, too bad, so sad, you did the wrong thing as a parent, expect to deal with it. But there's something inherently like the inherent responsibility you step into when you make that choice. Okay. So I presume, across America, you don't just walk into your local, like we have an office where you go to get your license called the
Hmm.
Roads and Transport Authority. You don't just walk into the RTA and say, look, my kid's 15, but I think they'd be a really good driver. I think they should get their license early because they're going to drive really well. Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's what we do with social media because, oh, well, Billy next door has it. And, Amelia up the road has it. And my kid's going to like miss out. So one is to actually recognize that their brains are probably not ready for the kind of bullying to happen, and certainly not 24/7 when they're younger than 13. Then we need to address like, why do people bully and what's going on and the sources of bullying? Because often we're still really, really crap at dealing with bullying. We need to work on the upstander effect, the people around who can see and watch this, standing up and saying that's not okay on behalf of the person being bullied. And they're often not going to do that because then they become the source of the bullying as well. So yes, what we know about this is it's not necessarily starting in online spaces and then coming into the playground. It often starts face to face and then is amplified through devices. And part of dealing with that is also having limits and agreement on when you'll be accessing your phone. Because if you're on your phone 24/7, then at any moment you can get this kind of hijack of information. At any moment, if I go on my phone, I'm going to see some really, really raw and distressing content about what's happening in different war zones around the world right now. So
Yeah.
we all have to be ready for that hijack of being called into the news and the humanity and the yucky stuff. And that's where I guess if parents are choosing to allow their kids into those spaces, we do need to monitor and mentor them through how to build those skills. Just like when we do get our driver's license, in my state at least, you have to do 120 hours of supervised driving. before you can go for your provisional license. And then there's 2 stages of provisional license where there are different rules for drivers so that we can actually help you get runs on the board, demonstrate that you can drive safely in order to get a full license. So similarly, I think we need some of those things, and we also need much more decent ways of dealing with bullying and basically teaching respectful relationships.
Yeah. So would you say the same thing for a kid who is, say, 14, 15, 16? So say they're past that age limit of, okay, we said they're allowed on social media and they experience that bullying.
Yeah. So again, if we take that driving analogy, would you put your kid who's 16 behind the wheel of a Ferrari?
No.
And they still, the brain doesn't probably finish developing for most of us until our mid-20s, maybe earlier for girls, about that time for boys. We learn through experience as well. So this is not to say, oh, well, you'll learn to deal with bullying by being bullied. This is about saying, well, we need to scaffold and support you in those online spaces because people are going to be people. And there's ways to shut down and change that behavior, but you still need that really strong bridge to connection with your adult people around you who hopefully have brains that are more developed and wiser and able to then step in and support you through those processes. But if you're picking up your phone at 2 o'clock in the morning and you have awful messages, then part of that is why you're picking up your phone at 2 o'clock in the morning. The other part is, well, what's going on for that person that they need to behave like that? And how do we intervene in between them?
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's such a scary thing for parents because it's like if you can't monitor them on social media or you don't maybe have all the awareness of like Snapchat, for example, like conversations and videos and photos disappear. Like there's no way for you to go and look at what's happened. And so I think there's a lot of fear for parents and to just say, well, my kid's not having that. Like,
Yeah. And when we do that, often what kids do is go and get that anyway. And
yes.
rather than having a parent who says, I'm not really confident with this is all really new, let's learn it together, let's be partners in working this out so you can build your skills while I'm building my skills. We go, too scary, no way, I heard that blah, 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 blah. Insert random headline. Kids go and get accounts anyway, and kids have to work really hard to hide that account. And then when things go wrong, they have no one to share that with. Or they share it with another 13, 14, 15-year-old who, again, does not have a developed brain. And it is a really unhelpful kind of situation. I've had kids sometimes who are like, I have to sleep with my phone because if my friend has a mental breakdown, I've got to be there for them. And I'm like, I'm missing all of these people who have done like 5 years of psychology training to be able to support each other. And I'm like, no, maybe the only thing that you need to do is make sure you're sharing the crisis helpline. Maybe the only thing you need to do is say, oh, that's really hard. That's really awful. I hate that you're going through this. Let me help you get support. Let's go and
Mhm.
find an adult who can solve this for us. But 2 teenagers with mental health problems trying to help one another out is not a great plan.
It's the blind leading the blind,
It is.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah. I understand the fear from parents. Just I have seen obviously a million stats and a million
Yeah.
studies on it, but there's things like, I read one that said like children and teens who spend more than 3 hours on social media a day double their risk of mental health problems.
Yeah.
And so how can
No.
you read that and not be like, oh no?
Well, what you need to do is switch this on. This is called the most powerful technology on the planet. And if we don't actually use our critical thinking skills, so I hear that and I go, okay, 3 hours on social media, who are they following?
Mhm.
What are they thinking when they consume that? Because if they're following, let's say, climate activists, let's say they're following people like Adam Grant, who everyone loves, and
Oh,
a
I do
social
like Adam Grant.
psychologist, right? These kids are getting all sorts of information. And what the problem is with a lot of the research that's done that does hit those headlines is really just look at time online, and it asks for self-report of time online. Now, I don't know about you, but even as an adult, I'm not so great at reporting how I spent my day. So when we're asking an underdeveloped brain to estimate how much time they spent online and then not looking at, well, how are you feeling before you went online? What are all of the other contextual factors in your life that might contribute to your mental health going down? It's really, really muddy research. It's methodologically shambolic is how I describe it. Then when researchers go and talk to gaming companies and they say, hey, can you give us some of the data? We're looking at these, 1,200 kids and their profiles. Here's their logins. Can you give us the data about time and give us some more data points? And then they report their findings. People go, they're in bed with the gaming companies and this is sponsored by the gaming companies. And so no, we're trying to do better research that actually will show the complexity of what we're doing online. Okay.
Right.
So again, teenage boy, maybe not really good at talking about his feelings in online Discord groups where they are then talking about all sorts of issues versus a similar person playing first person shooter, maybe talking to people in the manosphere. How do we quantify the difference in that time online? And that is not what research looks at. And that is not what is behind those headlines. So again, like the headlines I shared before, the, 1 gram of cocaine, I'm like, man, really? Like that is embarrassing for the person who said that.
Right.
And that's examples of media literacy, of actually not taking that on face value because a university researcher said that. And that's not to, diss people who have spent years researching things, but often within universities and within institutions, they're institutionalized. So we just do things the way we've always done them because innovation is quite scary in those institutions. And that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah,
Yeah. There's a really interesting documentary on Netflix.
called The Social Dilemma.
Yes. But one interesting part I wanted to ask you about was, they obviously interview a lot of people who work at these tech companies and design the tech, and they say, hey, would you let your kid have this tech? And they all said no. So how do you feel about parents who are kind of in that camp of my kid's not getting a phone until they're 20 or
Mhm.
19 or,
Yeah.
super late or never in their childhood?
Sure. So what I would say about The Social Dilemma is there's obviously, like any documentary, there's a lot of footage on the cutting room floor and perspectives and takes that you don't see because it doesn't fit that narrative. If we did a whole scale sample of people in Silicon Valley and we'd say, what do you actually do? There's a whole bunch of families who, yes, they use the devices. They're rich. They also have lots of other ways of doing things, co-curricular activities. They're off learning violin or piano or doing drama and all those things that people from low socioeconomic backgrounds possibly can't afford or can't access. So again, like my whole take on this is, have we surveyed every single person or have we chosen and cherry picked some of the people who are willing to sing from the Tristan Harris songbook, right? And all respect to him. I have been following him since he called it the time well spent kind of movement. I've got printouts from the internet from like 10 years ago of his stuff. But I think, again, even watching something like that, we have to have a critical lens to say, okay, they're trying to show us a perspective so that maybe we take some action. What I get worried about is that people watch that, freak out, and then do nothing, right? Because when you're in fear and when your amygdala is in that, oh my gosh, I've got to protect my children,
Mm-hmm.
we actually don't think clearly and make good decisions. So the
Yeah.
fear-based kind of approaches of scaring the hell out of parents into like a predator's going to take your kid or, like all of this stuff sometimes is unhelpful in its approach. It's not that it's not true. I had a conversation this morning actually with my daughter about not kidnapping, but when she watches lots of her friends at school are on Roblox. So she's not yet 7 and kids in her class are on Roblox. She watches some YouTube where the YouTubers are on Roblox. So she knows about Roblox, but she hasn't done Roblox. She's like, when can I have Roblox? I'm like, when you're 9, because that's
For
the
someone who's not
age.
familiar with Roblox, like how would you describe it?
So Roblox is the closest that we have to the metaverse at the moment. And basically what you
Okay.
do is you go into the game, but then it's kind of like an arcade. You go in and you can do all different games within the Roblox platform. Okay. So you don't play Roblox, you go into Roblox and then you play different modifications,
Gotcha.
different games, different parts of it. And it's probably like one of the top platforms that kids are using for gaming. So, like when we were talking about Roblox and we were talking about the idea that basically there's people online who pretend to be something that they're not in order to talk to kids and then maybe to get them to do rude things. Really, really simple. Just to say some people online are not who you think that they are. And you've got to get good at being able to spot that. Simple conversation. And then she was like, trying to go to me. So what I would ask them in this question, and then I would know if they were a kid or not. And you could see that it had generated this conversation. And in her mind, she was thinking, how will I spot the bad people? And to me, that was a win. And this is not to say I'm such a good parent, but it was just really interesting because I'm like, oh gosh, how do I explain that there might be people who ask her for nudes? How do I explain there might be people who
Yeah.
ask her to do some of these things and she's sick. I don't want to have that conversation yet, but I need to introduce something so I can scale it up. And just how interested she was to then further the conversation and problem solve, to me, was a really great sign that her brain is working in a way that I want it to so that she could be safe in those spaces. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of what I'm taking away from you is your belief in good quality content, but then this kind of like slow, age appropriate exposure over time,
Yeah.
rather than a parent who says you're not getting anything until you're 20 and then, hoping they've, just matured enough so that they know what to do when they have a phone when they're 20, but has had no practice or no experience up until a point much later in life,
That's
right?
right. So who says when you turn 20, you suddenly click in some of those skills? And this is just, how we're trained as parents to think, oh, at some point in the future, you will be this fully formed adult who does everything right. I am nearly 46 and I can tell you still am struggling with those things because I, fail to be consistent in lots of areas of my life. So it's much more real to be able to say, hey, we've got to work this out together. And this is really complex. And I reserve my right as your parent to restrict it. So some people think that I'm like for a tech free for all and that I'm a tech apologist, like, oh, Mark Zuckerberg didn't really mean to do this. And I'm not. I'm just realistic that this exists in our world. It's been, let loose into our world. Same with ChatGPT. I don't think we fully understood really what is happening with generative language models,
No way.
generative AI and large language models. I think there's still this like, oh, we don't know. Our hands are up in the air. Oh, it's too new. And, rather than curiosity to say, I need to learn this if I want to protect my kid. So I'm just all about being sensible and taking responsibility. Absolutely delay for as long as you possibly can, but be aware that by delaying without actually giving some access that is scaffolded and mediated and role modeled, you are actually doing your kids a disservice as well, because there's a whole bunch of other things that, we've talked about that can really not go right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like trying to put everything back in Pandora's box when sometimes
Absolutely. Yeah.
you just can't,
Yeah.
the technology is that.
Mhm. And working on that parenting relationship where you say, hey, we can explore this together. But, as I say, I reserve my right to change my mind. I reserve my right to say, hey, I know more about that now. And I've decided that that's actually not healthy. Here's why. Here's some of the risks. Here's what can happen to your brain. So when I took the TV away in the morning, I said it's actually because your brain's like a bucket. And when you're learning or when you're watching TV, you're filling your bucket up. And I want you to go to school with an empty bucket ready to learn, not with a whole bunch of good quality TV shows, but still content in your brain. And she was totally okay with that. And yeah, sometimes the big, I wish I could have TV. My life is terrible without TV in the morning. And then we go, yeah, I'm such a bad parent. Look at me, awful parent making you not have TV in the morning. I'm okay with that.
Yeah, no, I love your approach. So wrapping up here, so if people could take one thing away from our conversation or any final advice you have for parents as it relates to their children with technology, what would it be?
Look, I think it's just to be kind of more cognizant of the technology in our skulls still is the best technology, but we are not using it to our advantage. We are often outsourcing our thinking to social media, and that we really need to switch on our brains and take that personal responsibility to learn what we need to learn to make the decisions that are right for our families.
Okay. And then very lastly, where can people find out more about you and get connected?
Absolutely. So digitalnutrition.com.au. Don't just go to .com because that's like somebody trying to sell you vitamins. And look, if you type digital nutrition into your favorite search engine, I am what comes up. JocelynBrewer.com is my other website. And I am on most social platforms, not TikTok. I have Discord, for instance. That makes me very cool and young, where all the cool kids hang out. But yeah, LinkedIn and Facebook and all that usual jazz.
Amazing. Jocelyn, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure to chat. You can tell I like a good conversation.